Jonathan Haidt, Connections to the Modern History of Psychology by Ethan Oak. This project will try to connect Jonathan Haidt, based on his two books, The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind, with what I believe are 6 of his strongest connections to theorists, schools, and ideas throughout the modern history of psychology. Who is Jonathan Haidt? Before we examine Haidt's historical connections, it is useful to understand a little bit about who he is and where his ideas come from. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist and currently a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business. He earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1992 and then spent about 16 years teaching at the University of Virginia, where much of his early research on morality was conducted. Haidt became especially well known for developing moral foundations theory and what he calls the social intuitionist model. These theories challenges the traditional assumption that people arrive at moral conclusions primarily through careful reasoning. Instead, Haidt argues that moral judgments are often driven first by intuition and emotion, with reasoning typically occurring afterward. In addition to his academic work, Haidt has written several influential books. These include The Happiness Hypothesis, The Coddling of the American Mind, The Righteous Mind, which is the primary focus of this presentation, and more recently, The Anxious Generation, where he examines the effects of smartphones and social media on youth mental health. What makes Haidt particularly interesting from a history of psychology perspective is that his work brings together ideas from many early traditions, including Darwin's evolutionary theory, James's functionalism, research on emotion, social influence, group behavior, and moral development. Throughout this presentation, we'll see how Haidt builds upon these earlier psychological ideas while applying them to modern social and political issues. To understand where many of Haidt's ideas originate, we need to look at some of the historical influences that shaped his thinking. One of the most important of these influences was Charles Darwin. Darwin and evolutionary thought. One of the strongest historical influences on Jonathan Haidt's work is Charles Darwin. In many ways, Darwin provided the evolutionary foundations that supported the ideas found through both The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. Darwin argued that morality emerged gradually from social instincts such as sympathy, pride, and shame. Rather than viewing morality as something separate from nature, Darwin believed moral tendencies evolved because they helped humans live successfully in social groups. Groups whose members cooperated more effectively often had advantages over other groups that did not. Haidt builds directly on this idea in The Righteous Mind. His moral foundations theory opposes that humans possess several evolved phenomena, including care, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. According to Haidt, these foundations developed because they helped our ancestors solve recurring adaptive problems related to survival, cooperation, and group living. Darwin also believed that emotions evolved because they served important adaptive functions. Haidt extends this idea through his famous claim that intuition comes first, strategic reasoning second. His elephant and rider metaphor suggests that emotional and intuitive systems guide much of human behavior before conscious reasoning becomes involved. Rather than viewing emotion as irrational obstacles, Haidt argued that they are evolved psychological systems that helped our ancestors navigate social life. Darwin's influence also appears in The Coddling of the American Mind. One of Haidt's major arguments is that development requires challenge. He repeatedly argues that resilience develops through exposure to manageable difficulties, and that overprotection can interfere with normal psychological growth. This idea is reflected in the broader Darwinian principle that adaptation occurs in response to environmental pressures, rather than comfort. Haidt's discussion of anti-fragility and evolutionary mismatch further extend this evolutionary framework into modern questions about childhood development, social media, and mental health. Taken together, both books demonstrate that evolutionary thinking is one of the central pillars of Haidt's psychological worldview. Whether he is explaining morality, religion, cooperation, resilience, or mental health, Darwin's influence is visible throughout his works. While Darwin helped explain the evolutionary origins of morality and human behavior, another major influence on Haidt came from the very different tradition that focused on understanding the purpose and function of psychological processes. William James and functionalist thought. After Darwin, the next major historical influence I want to discuss is William James and the functionalist movement. Functionalism emerged partly as a reaction against structuralism. Rather than simply describing the contents of consciousness, functionalists want to understand the purpose of mental processes. They asked questions such as, what is behavior for? How does it help people adapt? What functions does it serve in everyday life? This style of thinking appears throughout Jonathan Haidt's work. In The Righteous Mind, Haidt repeatedly asks functionalistic questions. Rather than asking only what morality is, he asks what morality is for. He investigates why morality evolved, why humans form moral communities, why religion is so common across cultures, and how these systems help people cooperate. This is especially evident in part 3 of the book, where he discusses groupishness, the hive switch, and religion as a team sport. Haidt's treatment of religion is particularly similar to James's pragmatic approach. James often evaluated ideas according to their practical consequences rather than focusing solely on whether they were objectively true. Likewise, Haidt frequently examines what religion accomplishes. He argues that religion is often promotes cooperation, social cohesion, and group identity. Whether every religion belief is literally true is not the primary question he is trying to answer. Instead, he asks why religion persists and what social functions they serve. He, in fact, is an atheist. This functionalist perspective also appears throughout The Coddling of the American Mind, where Haidt argues that universities should prepare students for successful adulthood rather than simply providing information. He emphasizes resilience, independence, emotional regulation, and critical thinking as important outcomes for education. In other words, he asks what education is for and whether current practices are helping students function effectively in the real world. Taken together, both books demonstrate a remarkably functionalist style of thinking. Whether discussing morality, religion, education, or resilience, Haidt consistently focuses on the purpose and adaptive value of functional and social systems. James emphasizes the purpose of mental processes, but another influential psychologist psychologists focused on something very different: the hidden psychological forces operating beneath the conscious awareness, is who we'll discuss next. Freud and the unconscious mind. One of the most surprising connections I found in this project is between Sigmund Freud and Jonathan Haidt. At first glance, they seem very different. Freud is associated with psychoanalysis, dream interpretation, and clinical case studies, while Haidt is a modern social psychologist who relies on experiments and empirical research. However, despite these differences, both psychologists are remarkably close in their conclusions about human reasoning. Freud argued that much of human behavior is influenced by unconscious processes. According to psychoanalysis, people often are unaware of the true causes of their thoughts, feelings, and actions. Instead, unconscious motivations can shape their thoughts, feelings, and behavior. A very similar idea appears throughout The Righteous Mind, where Haidt argues that moral judgments are often driven by intuitions that occur automatically and rapidly and largely outside of awareness. His famous phrase is that intuition comes first and strategic reasoning comes second. He illustrates this idea throughout the elephant and rider metaphor, where the elephant represents unconscious, automatic, intuitive processes, while the rider represents conscious reasoning. Although the rider believes it's in control, the elephant is often what determines the direction first. This connection becomes even stronger when we look at Freud's concept of rationalization. Freud proposes that people frequently create explanations for behavior whose real causes remain hidden from awareness. Haidt makes a very similar argument, saying that the rider often acts as a lawyer rather than a scientist. Instead of objectively evaluating evidence, people often use reasoning to justify conclusions that their elephant has reached intuitively. Despite these similarities, there is an important difference between the two psychologists. Freud relied heavily on clinical interpretations and psychoanalytic methods, such as dream analysis and free association, whereas Haidt relied on experiments, social psychology, and empirical evidence. Therefore, I'm not arguing that Haidt is a Freudian psychologist, rather I'm arguing that both psychologists independently arrived at a similar conclusion. Conscious reasoning is not always the primary driver of human behavior. Although Freud and Haidt arrived at similar conclusions about the limits of conscious reasoning, Haidt's broader explanation of morality comes from evolutionary psychology rather than psychoanalysis. This brings us to one of the key figures who helped bridge Darwinian evolution in modern psychology, E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson in sociobiology. One of the most important historical figures connecting Charles Darwin to Jonathan Haidt is E.O. Wilson. While Darwin's established the basic principles of evolution through natural selection, Wilson helped extend evolutionary thinking into the study of social behavior. Wilson is best known for his 1975 book, Sociobiology, The New Synthesis. In this work, he argued that many aspects of social behavior could be understood through evolutionary principles. Behavior such as cooperation, altruism, social hierarchy, and group living did not emerge randomly. Instead, Wilson proposed that these behaviors evolved because they provided adaptive advantages. At the time, these ideas were highly controversial. Much of the 20th century psychology emphasized learning, environmental influences, and behaviorist explanations. Many scholars were uncomfortable with applying evolutionary theory to human behavior because they feared biological determinism or the misuse of evolutionary explanations. As a result, Wilson faced significant criticism for bringing evolutionary ideas back into discussion of human society. Jonathan Haidt explicitly discusses Wilson in The Righteous Mind and speaks very positively about his contributions. In fact, Haidt describes Wilson as one of the thinkers who helped reopen important questions about the evolutionary origins of morality and social behavior, even calling him a prophet. Haidt repeatedly argues that human beings possess evolved psychological systems that shape morality, cooperation, religion, and group identity. This connection is especially visible in moral foundations theory, where Haidt argues that moral foundations such as care, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty are not learned entirely from scratch. Instead, they represent evolved psychological predispositions that helped our ancestors solve recurring adaptive problems. This approach is heavily influenced by evolutionary thinking and shares important assumptions with both sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. Wilson also served as an important bridge between Darwin and modern psychology. Darwin explained how biological traits evolved, and Wilson applied evolutionary principles to social behavior. Haidt then applies these ideas to morality, religion, political psychology, and human cooperation. The influence of evolutionary thinking extends beyond The Righteous Mind, though. In The Coddling of the American Mind, Haidt argues that children evolved under conditions that included free play, independence, manageable risk, and face-to-face interactions, whereas modern environments often differ dramatically from these conditions. Haidt's discussion of evolutionary mismatch, overprotection, and resilience continues the same evolutionary perspective that can be traced through Darwin and Wilson. While Wilson helped explain many of the moral tendencies, where many of the moral tendencies may have come from, another important question is how moral thinking develops over the course of a person's life. To explore that question, we can turn to Piaget and Kohlberg. Piaget, Kohlberg, and developmental psychology. One of the most important developmental psychology connections in this project involve Jean Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and Jonathan Haidt. Piaget helped establish the idea that children actively construct their understanding of the world as they develop. Building on Piaget's work, Kohlberg proposed that moral development occurs through a series of increasingly sophisticated stages of moral reasoning. According to Kohlberg, people become more morally advanced as their ability to reason about ethical problems improves. Haidt discusses both Piaget and Kohlberg directly in The Righteous Mind, and in fact he argues that their work dominated moral psychology for much of the 20th century. However, Haidt ultimately disagrees with one of their central assumptions. Kohlberg's theory suggests that moral judgments are primarily a result of conscious reasoning, where Haidt argues that moral judgments are usually driven by fast, automatic intuitions before conscious reasoning begins. This disagreement forms one of the central debates of The Righteous Mind. Haidt summarizes his position through the social intuitionist model and the elephant rider metaphor. The elephant represents intuitive and emotional processing, while the rider represents conscious reasoning. According to Haidt, the rider often explains and justifies judgments that were already produced by the elephant. While the righteous mind focuses on how moral judgments are formed, the coddling of the American mind expands on Haidt's developmental concerns. In that book, Haidt examines the environments in which children and adolescents develop. He argues that resilience, independence, emotional regulation, and competence emerge through experience, challenge, and opportunities for autonomy. He worries that excessive protection may unintentionally limit opportunities for normal developmental growth. This broader developmental concerns connects well with theorists such as Erik Erikson, who argue that healthy development requires successfully navigating developmental challenges. Although Haidt does not directly discuss Erikson, both perspectives emphasize growth occurs through engagement with difficulties rather than avoidance of them. Taken together, these two books show that Haidt is concerned with development in two different ways. In The Righteous Mind, he focuses on how moral judgment develops and operates, and in The Coddling of the American Mind, he focuses on how environments shape the development of resilience and psychologically healthy adults. So far, we've examined several specific historical influences on Haidt's theories. However, it is also important to remember that Haidt is first and foremost a social psychologist, and many of his ideas can be traced back to the broader developmental and social psychology as a discipline. Haidt, the social psychologist. Although Jonathan Haidt is often discussed as a moral psychologist, he is still a social psychologist, with many of his ideas deeply connected to the early development of social psychology. One of the earliest figures is Floyd Henry Allport, who helped establish social psychology as an experimental science. Allport argued that social behavior should be studied empirically rather than through philosophical speculation. Haidt followed this tradition by using experiments, surveys, and cross-cultural research to study morality, political beliefs, and social behavior. Kurt Lewin, who was heavily influenced by the Gestalt psychologists, emphasized group dynamics and the influence of social environments on behavior, and was a founder of social psychology. This is highly relevant to Haidt's work. Throughout The Righteous Mind, Haidt argues that people think and behave within moral communities and social groups. His discussions of tribalism, political identity, religion, and group selection all reflect the importance of group processes. In The Coddling of the American Mind, Haidt also examines how developmental environments shape behavior and mental health outcomes. Fritz Heider, attribution theory, is also surprisingly relevant. Heider argued that people naturally try to explain the behavior of others, as seen in his POX models, which describe how people seek consistency in their relationships and beliefs. This can be seen in modern political tribalism. If I strongly identify with a political group and dislike another group, I often assume that members of the opposing group possess negative traits. Haidt's discussion of moral matrices and political polarization reflect many of these same dynamics. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance may be one of the strongest social psychology connections in the entire project. Festinger argued that people experience psychological discomfort when beliefs and behavior conflict. Haidt similarly argues that people often justify intuitions after the fact. His famous description of the rider acting as a lawyer rather than a scientist resembles Festinger's observations that people frequently adjust their beliefs to maintain consistency. Solomon Arsht demonstrates that power of conformity and social influence. Haidt repeatedly argues that humans are naturally groupish creatures. Many of our moral beliefs are shaped by the groups in which we belong. His discussions of religion, politics, and tribalism all highlight the influence of conformity and social identity. Stanley Milgram's work on obedience is also relevant. One of Haidt's moral foundations is authority. Milgram demonstrates that people often defer to legitimate authority figures, even when doing so conflicts with personal values. Haidt's authority foundation helps explain why respect for hierarchy and authority remains a powerful moral force in many societies. Finally, Philip Zimbardo's emphasis of the power of situations in shaping behavior in his situational hypothesis, which argued that ordinary people can behave differently depending on their environment, which Haidt similarly emphasizes, in which that social context, group identity, and institutional environments influence how people think and behave. This perspective is particularly visible in The Coddling of the American Mind, where changing social environments are presented as a major factor influencing modern youth development and political violence. Taken together, these early social psychologists provide a historical foundation for many of Haidt's ideas. While Haidt focused specifically on morality, politics, religion, and development, his work operates within a broader social psychological tradition that emphasizes the influence of groups, social contexts, and interpersonal relationships on human behavior. For this presentation, I have examined John Haidt's work through the lens of the modern history of psychology, and what became clear is that Haidt's ideas did not emerge in isolation. Instead, they reflected themes that have appeared throughout psychology for more than a century. We can see Darwin's influence in Haidt's evolutionary approach to morality, William James' influence in his focus on the function of psychological systems, Freud's influence in his emphasis on unconscious processes, E.O. Wilson's influence in his evolutionary explanations for social behavior, developmental influences through his engagement with Piaget and Kohlberg, and social psychological influences through thinkers such as Lewin, Festinger, Arsht, Milgram, and others. What is particularly remarkable is that these are only a small sample of the connections that can be found in just two of Haidt's books, The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. Additional links can be drawn to figures such as Helmholtz, Kant, Brentano, Hall, Woodworth, Baldwin, Fromm, Winnicott, and Gestalt psychologists. Ultimately, Haidt serves as an example of how modern psychology continues to build upon the ideas from the past. His work demonstrates that the history of psychology is not simply a connection of old theories, but an ongoing conversation that continues to shape how we understand human thought, behavior, morality, and psychology today.